All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're thrilled to have you with us. So my name is Ann Jerzik. I'm the Director of Outreach and Advocacy for the Bay Foundation. I work out of our Virginia office, and we're thrilled that you were able to join us today. So a couple housekeeping notes. We are recording the presentation. Usually it takes us about 2 days to post it up to our website. As soon as it's posted, I'll send the link out to everyone who is registered, so you'll get it. I hope that you'll find this webinar to be informative and engaging and worthwhile sharing. So when we send that email out to you, please feel free to share it with your friends and family. I'd like to ask you to use the Q&A. If you scroll, you can sort of hover, and some people's screen it's down at the bottom and some people it's at the top. But use the Q&A to ask questions, please, instead of the chat. If you could, let's just reserve the chat for things like, the screens aren't showing, or, there's some technical difficulty. And that way we will moderate the Q&A as we go through the presentation. So from a timing perspective, Rich will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. And then if past webinars are any indication, we will have a very lively Q&A session, and we'll do our best to answer all questions before we finish up at 1 o'clock. And okay. So I want to give you just a little bit of perspective on why we're offering this particular topic. You might have seen that last year Scientific American had published an article, and it titled "The Ocean is Running Out of Breath." It was published in February of 2019, and I highly encourage any of you to Google it. I'll put the link in the chat box in just a minute. But it reported that oxygen levels in some tropical regions had dropped by as much as 40% in the last 50 years, and that on average we were losing 2% globally. So clearly this is dead zones are a global problem. It's a worldwide food web problem. If you think about how sensitive zooplankton are to dissolved oxygen levels in the water. And then, anecdotally, I'll just say that whenever the Bay Foundation is involved in either a lawsuit that's defending the Bay, the Bay cleanup plan, or if there is some momentous news about it, we will get emails from people from the Puget Sound, from the Great Lakes, from the Gulf of Mexico, from Tampa Bay. There are many people around the world who are watching this progress and trying to figure out whether or not there are portions of the program that can be duplicated in their neck of the woods. And so we thought, well, we've got this great opportunity now, because Rich Batiuk has been part of this program, part of the Bay program for 28 years, right, Rich, before you retired. And he was most recently the Associate Director for Science, Analysis, and Implementation, and has really ran the Chesapeake Bay Program partnership. And I thought, well, who better to sort of both look at this from a global perspective, as well as to sort of tell us, well, what's working about the Bay Cleanup Plan that might be picked up and modeled elsewhere. Since his retirement, he has traveled around the world, so he's seen both some water quality issues worldwide, as well as helping to advise on solutions that other countries could perhaps consider. So with that, Rich, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here today.
Great, thanks, Ann. Good afternoon, folks. So let's go ahead and dive in. Before, as Ann mentioned, actually for almost 34 years, before I retired from the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Chesapeake Bay Program office in Annapolis, I worked really for a state, federal, local business, academic partnership, agricultural community partnership that was focused on restoring not only the Chesapeake Bay, but the surrounding 6-state watershed as well. So this was my home when I wasn't on the road traveling to partners around the Chesapeake Bay watershed. I traveled extensively around the United States and up into Canada. And as Ann mentioned, I've been fortunate to also travel around the world a little bit more when I've been retired now, working with others as well. So that was the office for about 34 years. Here's my office today, which is out, in this case, it's on Janes Island on the Eastern Shore. I'm an avid fly fisherman. I'm a kayaker, canoer. So I spend part of my time watching and enjoying the fruits of the labor of restoring the Chesapeake, but also understanding that system and have we made a difference over the last 3 to 4 decades worth of partnership-driven restoration efforts. So since then, I've been fortunate to team up with my colleague who was until 2 years ago, the director for the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, Holly Greening. She and I bring around 70 years worth of experience. So we're actually using that experience, and as Ann mentioned, working with partners around the United States and actually around the world, sharing our combined 70 years worth of efforts, not only in the Tampa Bay and Chesapeake Bay, but our experience with many other places as well. In the past 2 years, we've actually worked with 47 different agencies, organizations, institutions, partnerships, again, around the world. Right now, we're actually working with colleagues in Spain on a small lagoon system there. We've got an active exchange program we're setting up, for example, with New Zealand as well. So a lot of efforts underway across, not only across the United States, but really sharing from probably the 2 most successful estuarine cleanup programs, Tampa Bay, which actually has achieved a lot of its restoration goals, and in the Chesapeake, as we'll say, a lot of progress, but still a lot of work still to be done there. But as Ann mentioned, if you look around the world, a lot of these coastal systems, not only estuaries, but coastal lagoons and bayments, they're actually heading in the wrong direction. As human population has increased, and you can see in these red areas around the coastlines of all the continents, there are places what we refer to as dead zones. In other words, there's so much nutrient and sediment pollution coming into these coastal systems that when the algae that's fueled by the excess nitrogen and phosphorus, when it dies off, it actually robs the surrounding water column of oxygen. And you end up with places in the deeper areas in these coastal systems completely lacking oxygen. Whether you're a fish or a little tiny animal called a zooplankton or an oyster, you need oxygen like us humans that we're breathing in the air. They do the same thing underwater as well. So the challenge is how do you reverse the course when you've got more and more human, not only increasing in population, but more and more countries have people moving within 50 miles of the coastline. And we've seen the same thing in the Chesapeake as well. So when the world's dead zones are increasing, not only in size, but more and more reported over time, why have we been able to actually start to shrink the Chesapeake Bay dead zone? So we're going to explore that in a minute. And if you want to go ahead and put up the first survey question so folks can start to interact with us a little bit more this afternoon. So if you can go ahead and, if you have a chance, on your computer screen in front of you right now, there's a question that says, what was the population of the Chesapeake Bay watershed back in the 1950s when the Chesapeake Bay was last healthy? So that was probably the time frame that we focused as a partnership over the last 3 or 4 decades of, can we get ourselves back to the 1950s kind of condition when fisheries, when underwater grasses, when oysters, crabs were fairly abundant after World War II and as the Green Revolution was occurring in that time frame as well. So give folks a couple more seconds to see it. So the polling is closed. Actually, so in the 1950s, the Chesapeake Bay watershed, so that's the 6 states, from New York down to Virginia, over to Delaware, over into the Shenandoahs, into West Virginia, with Washington, D.C. in the middle and Pennsylvania. They had 8 million people, in the 1950s. By the time that the partnership started in the early 1980s, we were starting to hit around 12 million people. And then now we're above 18 million people. So in the face of that increase from 8 million people to 18 million people, so you've got another 10 million people in the watershed, we actually need to then reduce that impact of those footprints of that additional number of people in order to get back to 1950s kind of condition that we've got in there as well. So let's go ahead and keep moving here. So we're facing a situation where we've got a doubling of population, more than doubling of population from the 1950s, and we're trying to get back to a Chesapeake Bay that we last saw during that time. So one of the key things that we've been able to look at the last 3.5 decades worth of the Chesapeake Bay Program partnership are what are the key lessons learned among the state, federal, local partners, academic partners, business community, agricultural community, wastewater municipal authority community as well. So these 6 ones, I want to walk you through and give you some examples of what we've been sharing with both other groups and partnerships, organizations that are focused around large interstate or large water bodies within a single state itself. And also, as Ann mentioned, sharing it with others around the world, particularly our European colleagues, colleagues in Asia, colleagues down in Australia, in Africa, just about on every continent, including South America. We've had opportunities to share the Chesapeake Bay story and what's been happening over the last 35, 36 years. So each of these lessons learned, as I mentioned, I'm going to walk through and give you some specific examples. But we found, particularly my partner, Holly Greening, and I, as we've been working the last 2 years, it doesn't matter what size, what the issues are that you're facing when you have a shared water body, you really need a series of things in hand. And they can take different forms, but you need essentially a big tent in which you can gather partners around and people can feel that they're part of a decision-making process. You need to have a very, very solid scientific foundation. The academic partners from our research institutions and state and federal science agencies are critical to a successful restoration effort. You need to know where you're going, that being goals, and you need to continue to assess progress on the basis of that. Critical to the Chesapeake was having a very simple to understand definition of what clean water meant. If you didn't have that, again, where were you going and what were you asking for, in this case, from 18 million people that make up the Chesapeake Bay watershed itself. One of the critical things we found, not only in our systems, but successful programs around the country and around the world, that they have extensive and collaborative monitoring systems. In other words, they're going out and collecting samples, whether it be water quality, measuring underwater grasses through aerial photography, netting fish and looking at the catch and the health of those fishery populations. They have strong monitoring programs in place. And probably the most difficult piece to do, and we actually have a challenge in the Chesapeake, and that is setting up a system for accountability. So the first piece is, as I mentioned, I referred to it as building a tent. So what you're looking at here is a pretty complex organizational chart. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but the important piece is, as you look at these different boxes, it allows a place at the table within a partnership that actually has agreed to consensus-based decision-making. In other words, until you get up to what we call the Chesapeake Executive Council, and that's the governors of the 6 states, the mayor of the District of Columbia, the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency's administrator, until you get to that level, everybody underneath that, in order to make a decision, and this partnership has made hundreds, if not thousands of decisions over its decadal lifespan, have got to be consensus. That doesn't mean the lowest common denominator. It means everybody can buy into something that they can live with as well. And the reason for all these different boxes is it's a complex ecosystem we're trying to restore out there, but we also wanted to find a place at the table for elected mayors, for academic partners, for advocacy groups, for federal partners, for people in the business community, a place where everybody could find a place where they could provide their expertise and they could be part of a shared decision-making process as well. And like if you think of a tree, and we always see what's sitting there in the ground and living up there, but underneath that tree is actually the thing that drives it, and that is the whole root system. That root system, provides stability to the tree during those hurricanes that we see in the Chesapeake, and during those droughts, it's digging deep there to get at groundwater well below the surface itself. It's drawing in nutrients and it's pumping them up into the upper branches of the tree. In the case of the Chesapeake, we have the same thing. The 6 boxes, across the top there, called goal implementation teams. They reflect the 6 large-scale goals that the state, federal, local, business, academic partnership has agreed to in terms of fisheries, habitats in our estuarine and free-flowing rivers and streams, protecting water quality, healthy watersheds, which protect what comes down into the Chesapeake itself, fostering stewardship, looking at education, informing people, and then managing the partnership itself. The green boxes underneath there are actually where technical and programmatic folks get together on different topics. And they're the ones that draw the science. They draw the feedback from the communities that they work with, whether it's urban farmers or agricultural farmers out in rural parts of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. They are the places in which we have seats and tables in which a lot of partners can come and help make this entire partnership work. So having a management structure that's big enough to have a diversity of partners and a diversity of perspectives and understanding the ground rules of how you actually work together and make decisions is critical for something as big as the Chesapeake Bay, or for like the small lagoon system we're working with on the Mediterranean and Spain, or other places around the world and around the country. You need to have a place in which your partners can come together. One of the things we also found was you need to involve the highest levels of leadership. That doesn't necessarily mean, as I mentioned earlier, we're fortunate to have the governors of the 6 states that have a part of the Chesapeake itself, the mayor of the District of Columbia, the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, which is a tri-state legislative commission, an EPA administrator that represents around 26 different federal government agencies. That also means that we're getting mayors and township supervisors and county councilors at the table to recognize or to represent local governments. They're getting university presidents, recognized leaders in the scientific community, recognized people in the business community, in the advocacy community as well. So we're trying to get leadership in all its different forms and get those folks to be within the partnership itself and leading within the partnership and within the communities that they represent across the 6-state watershed itself. So it's getting people who can in fact inform, help make decisions, and then take those decisions and help implement them across the diversity of the landscape that makes up the Chesapeake Bay watershed. One of the key things that I mentioned as well was having a strong scientific foundation. To do that, that means not only do you need to talk and work with scientists, they actually need an operational role and set of responsibilities within your partnership. One of the things we've been fortunate in the Chesapeake Bay region is really since the early stages of the partnership in the mid-1980s, we established what we call the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. So this was an independent body supported by the partnership and staffed, but they had an independent reactive and proactive role for the partnership. They were actively bringing in science, but they were also in a role to then react to decisions that were being made, policies that were being considered. They were able to provide peer review. In other words, a management issue was brought to their attention. But equally important, they were also asked to look ahead and take a look at what are the issues that are coming down the pike. Things like climate change or plastics as a form of pollutants we hadn't thought about. Other issues like invasive species that were coming in there. How can the partnership get ready for these as well? So on your left-hand part of the screen, there's one example of hundreds that stack, the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, develop either workshop reports, issue papers, independent reviews. In this case, it was looking at the issue of Conowingo Dam, the last of 3 major dams on the Susquehanna just before the Susquehanna actually comes into Chesapeake Bay at Havre de Grace, Maryland. There was concerns about the dam was actually filling up and was no longer being a real large filter for nutrient and sediment pollutions. And that was the case based on the stack report. But they drew together a tremendous amount of science and information and laid out for the management community some real clear conclusions and their recommendations of what the science was indicating and how managers could work going forward with some level of certainty and where the areas of uncertainty related remained as well. So having that strong scientific basis was important, but it's not just having scientists together. One of my jobs, and you can see my smiling face there as well, was actually for decades is to synthesize and work with the scientific community, with policymakers and local, state, and federal governments, including Congress, to work with agency managers, to work with farmers, with municipal authority operators, with a whole host of different people that had a role to play in the partnership and bring information and science to them, and then at the same time understand their needs and working that through as well. So we were fortunate to have my counterparts and some of my state and federal partners out there that were really science synthesizers to bring that information to the table. And we're also fortunate to have universities like University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, their Ian Center, who took on responsibility of, in this case, for as an example of what were the lessons learned after about 25, 30 years worth of restoration. And by looking at that science critically, what can we learn for the future and how can we put that in place as well? Another thing that we found that was important was there's a tremendous amount of science out there. We're fortunate, again, the Chesapeake region, we have probably hundreds of universities, colleges, community colleges that are generating science information. When you this overwhelming set out there, how do you bring it together and make it work and help inform better decisions, whether it's with oysters or air quality issues, or you know, what's the size of a tree planting along a stream that's going to be the most effective, but not take too much land out of production for a local farmer there. We used in the Chesapeake region a series of models. These are sort of mathematical formulations that take a tremendous amount of science and long-term monitoring data sets and balance those two to then allow us to ask what-if questions. So if we had more time, we could sort of work through this, but you can see the partnership, and these are partnership models, not a particular agency, not EPA, not Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. They were ones that the partnership developed, approved the application of it, and then used themselves as well. But it deals with issues from air quality issues to changes in the land uses in the past and into the future, all the way up to including things like oysters and other filter feeders like menhaden as a part of our decision-making process. So one of the things that successful partnerships do is they use different mechanisms to synthesize science and put it into managers' hands for good applications. And for asking and helping inform, not making, but helping inform making decisions out there. So if you jump in a car and you're going to take a trip somewhere, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, where am I going? Like a restoration partnership in the Chesapeake or other places around the world, if you don't know where you're going, how in the heck can you plan out that restoration protection actions? How do you know what to ask people, whether it's in terms of fisheries or improving water quality? In the case of the Chesapeake, we put an early emphasis on numerical goal setting. In other words, setting a goal, in this example, for blue crabs, in terms of what is the level of blue crabs that we would ideally like to have out there population-wise, and then that would support good, healthy harvest. And what is the threshold? There are around 75 million females that you're close to over-harvesting that population. So the emphasis on not only having it numerical, but having it so that you can go out there and monitor it, that in fact you can report progress on that towards its achievement, and you can go back and assess, is this really the right goal that we've got? Not trying to move the goalposts, but being sure that the science that was available when you developed that goal has continued to support that this in fact is what we're trying to do to restore it. So the Chesapeake Bay Partnership, Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership has had a long history, really back into the late 1980s and since then, of setting numerical goals so that in fact the public can understand, and everybody we're asking to do something different can understand where we're going, and then are we making progress towards there? Have we actually achieved what we're trying to get done out there as well? Blue crabs here is just, I think, a very good example of other goals that the partnership has agreed to. One of the key things by having that goal and knowing that when you're taking that trip, not only where you need to go, but what's the best way to get there. And oftentimes that path to get there is pretty tough, that you've been putting pollutants into, in the case of the Chesapeake, not just for tens of years, but in some cases decades. You got to turn back that clock. Like we talked earlier about the 1950s is the kind of Chesapeake Bay we're trying to shoot for, but with a population that's more than doubled in terms of the footprint of us humans and more intensive agriculture across parts of the watershed as well. But having those goals allows us to report back to the public on how we're doing and in different forms. And on your left-hand side, the partnership every year puts out what they call the Bay Barometer, that the goals that I described earlier, whether it's in fisheries or in education, on oyster reef restoration, lays out what progress we're making, what are the challenges that we need to overcome to do it, and then it lays out some success stories at the local scale as, again, where we've got some challenges. On the right-hand side, This is an effort led by the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Sciences that puts together a report card on the Chesapeake. These two reports are based on the same monitoring data, but they look at it from a different way of how to display that and have different audiences. A third report they don't have up here is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, an advocacy group that again draws from the same rich database that's out there. It puts its own State of the Bay and watershed report out there so it can report to the public. So having actually multiple reports out there, somebody might say the public gets confused. I think we better inform them because each one of these reports has a specific objective in mind and a way of informing the audience. What you're often seeing is they're saying the same message. They may be showing it through different pictures, but the same basic sets of information are coming through there as well. So it's key to having goals is not only have them, but to report to the public openly, regularly, and not only talk about progress, talk about where in fact you're falling behind, and use the wealth of information and science available to say, why are we not making the progress we are, and where do we go from here? So, and this would be probably a good time to put up our second survey question for folks on the webinar. So this question is asking, what is the deadline adopted by the 6 states, the District of Columbia and the United States Environmental Protection Agency for cleaning up the sources of pollutants into the Chesapeake itself? So what is the date that everybody at governors, mayor of District of Columbia, EPA administrator all agreed to work towards? This one's a pretty unique one in the Chesapeake because folks are finishing up voting here. And that is oftentimes partnerships will say they have a goal for cleaning it up, but they won't put a deadline in place. And that deadline is critical so that there's an accountability and there's an expectation by the public of when things are going to be happening out there as well. So we have most folks voting for 2025, and that's correct. So when the partnership, the 6 states, the district, EPA, and all the others worked on as the Chesapeake Bay Foundation calls it, the blueprint, I referred to it as the Bay pollution diet out there. When that was agreed to, everyone also agreed to, we're going to get the practices in place, do the upgrades, the treatment upgrades by 2025. The Bay not necessarily be clean by then, but the actions necessary to do it would be put in place there. 2018 was sort of our midpoint assessment heading to 2025 and 2040. That might be, there might be some parts of the system that are going to take that long to sort of finally come all the way through there as well. But great to see folks coming up with the right answer, which was 2025. So one of the other key things too, in addition to having goals out there, is to regularly assess those goals and to be sure that you're making progress. So what you see in front of you right now is really the history of the Chesapeake Bay Program partnership from the first Chesapeake Bay Agreement in 1983 all the way through that 2025 deadline that you all just were surveyed on as well. What you'll notice on there too is that there's a periodic, maybe about 5 to 7 year time frame, either between agreements, and there have been 4 of them over the lifetime of the partnership, but also you'll see the word reevaluation or evaluation come up, or midpoint assessment come up in there as well. Oftentimes, partnerships that are not successful will put a goal out there, we'll put a plan, and we'll sort of sit back and say, okay, let everybody go do what they need to do. What they don't have is a system for not questioning, but going back and looking at the data, looking at the science, looking at the response of all the engaged partners and stakeholders and say, have we done enough? Has it been effective? What can we do better? What do we need to change along the way? It's not moving the goalpost every time. What it is saying, what have I learned better? Can I get there? How can I recognize people that are being successful? How can I work with folks that need to lend a helping hand to move forward as well? So you can see that process really built in, and not on an exact every 5 to 7 year time frame, but basically that's about the time frame that we use up the available science and information, and we want to proceed forward to. That's a very healthy system. One of the key things that I mentioned too is that's very simply describing, in this case, one of the key goals for the Chesapeake, and that is clean water. My neighbors can understand it. Members of Congress on the Hill can understand it. Farmers up in New York can understand it. Folks working on wastewater treatment facilities in West Virginia. City planners down in Richmond can understand. fish need oxygen. Underwater grasses like plants here up above the water need light, and oysters and others need good food. Very simple definition of that. Yes, there's a tremendous amount of science, excuse me, built in here, but that science supports this very simple way of doing it. What we found is other not as successful partners around the world haven't figured out they either get too complex or they don't tailor their definition of clean water to their water body. Let me give you an example of that. What you're looking at here is, think of a planning and zoning map for a city or for a county. So you're going in there and saying, these places I want to have single family residential. I want to have condominiums or apartment complexes over here. I want small businesses over here. I want a commercial area over here. I want open space here. The states and EPA and other partners did the same thing for the Chesapeake. They not only looked across the surface water, but also through depth. In other words, Mother Nature didn't make the Chesapeake as one homogenized, mixed up system. She purposely made parts that were shallow, that different critters like crabs and underwater grasses like. She made deep areas that oysters and bottom feeding fish wanted to be in there. Surface waters for fish that some of us like to go for, like rockfish or mackerel or bluefish across there as well. So this system was set up so that you could take that in some areas you're going to need, on this next slide, different levels of dissolved oxygen for the species that we want to try to protect and restore. In other words, a mother rockfish, when she's spawning up in Richmond or up in Washington, D.C., or on the Eastern Shore, she needs around 5 or 6 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen. Contrast that with some worms and clams down on the bottom and maybe 40 or 50 feet of water off of the Bay Bridge. They only need 1 milligram per liter of dissolved oxygen. So we used our science plus our zoning map of the Chesapeake to map the two out and to simply describe good oxygen is necessary, but good oxygen gets defined differently depending on how deep and what time of the year you are on the Chesapeake as well. So Mother Nature told us, the science indicated it. We want to be sure we had the right levels of oxygen for those critters and not asking too much or too little of people around the Chesapeake Bay watershed in terms of reducing nutrient pollution coming into the Chesapeake as well. A simple definition, but built on a solid foundation of decades of good science from many universities and colleges and others around the Chesapeake Bay watershed itself. But by doing that and actually looking at these different habitats, we're able to do something again that very few other efforts, particularly in those places that have dead zones, they don't have either the monitoring in place, they don't have the goals necessary to do it, or the agreement by all the partners of how do you look at all this monitoring data and how do you compare it to these different levels of oxygen necessary. So let's look at this set of maps from left to right for a minute here. On your left-hand side, that's the if you're a rockfish or a mackerel or others that are in the top of the water column, maybe around from the surface to around 30 plus feet down into the Chesapeake or into a tidal river. This is what we call the open water habitat. So the areas that are in green, that means now and I think it was 2018 was this latest set of data. That means you've got oxygen conditions that are fully supportive of the fish that survive there. If you're in the blue, you're getting close. But so that, a pretty good report card. I can tell you back in 1985, there were a lot more orange and red in those areas. So we've made a lot of progress. You go down to the deeper waters. So now think in terms of crabs going down deep or oysters, spot and croaker down near the bottoms in 35, 40 feet of water. See more orange in there, but you're still seeing some places that we're making progress in there as well. And then slicing even deeper, this is where our dead zones are currently located. You don't see any green or blue there. We still have a lot of work to do. But we do understand, what the condition is, and I'll show you in a minute that in fact it's been improving over time. We still got more work in order to turn those areas green, but we are making progress towards that as well. And the reason we can say that, and again, I've been to China, I've been over in Europe and stuff. Oftentimes, what they don't do is to put a comprehensive and a collaborative monitoring network in place. So on your right-hand side, if you counted up all those dots, we'd give you a little bit more time to do it. You'd find about 150, 160 of stations that between Maryland, Virginia, District of Columbia, and Delaware, and their academic counterparts like Virginia Institute of Marine Science, Oldham University, University of Maryland, University of Delaware. Those partners are working collaboratively together with EPA and state funding to monitor the Chesapeake Bay, and have been doing so for now almost 35 years. That's a huge set of information, allows us to do the kind of charts that you saw on the previous one. And then on the left-hand side, the similar kind of network, but in this case, it's up in the streams and rivers. And we're fortunate, we've got probably about 10,000 miles of streams and rivers that actually eventually come into the Chesapeake and its tidal rivers and bayments. So we've been evolving a network that started in the late 80s, but has evolved really up through the last decade or so to bring more stations in there, so we can understand not to every one of those miles, those 10,000 miles, but enough in terms of large sections of the watershed, and between state boundaries in some cases as well, what the changes in water quality conditions in the free-flowing streams and rivers, and as they're coming into the Chesapeake Bay. And then on the right-hand side, we can find out what's happening there as well. So the key thing is to not only build a network, but allow it to evolve over time. In other words, questions, management needs, issues, science, they all evolve over time. One of the things that the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership has done, and that is allows its monitoring systems to evolve over time. So it's not one monitoring program. You can actually look at 11 different elements here, and these are not all of them because they're fisheries monitoring. There's a whole host of others as well. But you can see on this timeline that they're part of this monitoring program that had been going on pretty uninterrupted for 3.5 decades. And there are other parts that were stopped along the way because they weren't providing really management relevant information. And we initiated new ones where we weren't understanding a part of the system that was important for us to monitor it more directly, collaboratively as a partnership as well. So in this case, oftentimes people put a station in place and they defend it, don't change it because you're going to lose information. Absolutely. But you've got to understand there's a limited set of dollars out there. In this case, not one single partner, agency, institution, or organization made decisions on the monitoring system. It was literally collaboratively through decision-making, the entire Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership agreed to changes along the way to provide better and better information for all the partners to make decisions. And then finally, one of the most difficult things to do, and this is still a challenge within the current partnership, and that is to put a system in place that holds partners, that holds implementers, people that are assigned responsibility to make something happen at a small scale, a state scale, a watershed scale, and ensure that they're carrying out what they're asked to do. It's not to embarrass. It's not to flash in front and say, oh, you're not doing the right thing. But it is, in fact, to hold them accountable to what's happening. And this was a system until, I think, about 1.5 years ago that EPA, with the agreement of the states, would publish annually in terms of, are the states, for the different source sectors that they're trying to reduce nutrient pollution from, are they doing the right thing? Are they making progress? Are they accountable to the public? Or as you can see where Pennsylvania's got 2 red areas there, are they in fact falling behind? And we're not expecting another state to pick up. That state has got to carry out its obligations. So one of the things that we had done, here's an example for holding partners accountable. In the case of Pennsylvania, this is estimates of what kind of load reductions have happened over time using the partnership suite of models. We have monitoring data as well, but we also use models to understand what they're putting on the ground, what we think has been reduced. So by 2018, they had only been 15 million pounds down. They still had 34 million pounds to go. By 2018, they should have been 60% of the way. In other words, flip those 2 numbers. They should have been 34 million pounds towards it, and then something around 15 still to go to hit that 2025 target out there as well. Pennsylvania understood it, other partners did as well, but that public accounting, this is where it starts to fall apart. That my former agency, EPA, didn't take the actions that it committed to a decade prior to that as a part of the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, or that pollution diet, that blueprint, that would hold Pennsylvania and others accountable to doing that. The system was set up. It was actually generated by a prior governor from Virginia, Governor Kane. He actually brought this issue to the table to be sure that the states, feds, and locals were all accountable to the public for what was happening out there as well. That system is unfortunately broken down. So this is one of the lessons learned that we're still learning in the Chesapeake. Until we can figure that public accountability out, I'm not sure that we're going to get there. but we have a system in place to do it, to measure it as well. Besides that little blurb there, and certainly a way to go, I can tell you that this is working. Let's quickly finish this up so you all will have some chance to provide some questions and stuff. The Clean Air Act, as you can see on the left-hand side, that sort of cream-colored area, that's actually the airshed where the majority of air pollutants that are coming into the Chesapeake Bay watershed are coming from. So we share that, not a watershed. A watershed is our 6 states. That airshed is actually 17 states and 3 Canadian provinces have an influence on Chesapeake Bay water quality. But I can tell you that our scientists have indicated that as we've been cleaning up our tailpipes and how we generate electricity, the Chesapeake Bay is getting a lot cleaner because of that. A tremendous amount of work has been done by hundreds of thousands of engineers, local governments, local officials. The whole wastewater treatment industry has done a phenomenal job. It's really unprecedented worldwide. And that is, they started out discharging around 100 million pounds of nitrogen to local streams and rivers and eventually into the Chesapeake Bay from around 470 significant, what we call sort of big to medium-sized industrial municipal facilities. And they did something oftentimes governments, whether local, state, or federal, do, and that is they achieved their goal. They achieved it early, and they achieved it with some space to potentially grow over time. That is a significant, and this is across all 6 states, hundreds of counties, lots of work by local government officials and funding coming from state, federal, and local partners as well. A huge reduction in pollutants, this one for nitrogen, similar one for phosphorus. The Chesapeake Bay is running cleaner for that as well. Here's why I refer to is a pollution diet, because that pie chart is shrinking over time. This one you can see phosphorus is shrinking over time. We're close to achieving our phosphorus goals, but there's still a fair amount of phosphorus that's remaining, particularly in soils on agricultural fields, and even in some of our urban, suburban areas out there. So we still have work to do on phosphorus, but made a tremendous amount of progress. Nitrogen, this is still a heck of a lot of progress, but as you look at on the 2018 slide, we still need to reduce the Chesapeake Bay's nitrogen diet by an additional 50 million pounds. In other words, we need more from, particularly from agriculture. We need to get a little bit more from the urban stormwater area, but particularly from agriculture. They need to bring more, because the wastewater treatment plants, as you've seen, have not only met their goal, they've exceeded it, and they want to keep a little bit of that extra room that they've made in there for themselves. And then finally, this chart, I think, is one of the ones that's most telling, coming from our scientific community and other partners that have been monitoring the system along the way. And that is, for the early years from 1990 through around 2005, that blue bar that goes up and down over time, that's actually the amount of river flow that is coming into the Chesapeake from all the major rivers on all 6 states in the District of Columbia. The histogram bars themselves are our best estimate through monitoring data and model output of what the loads were in the Chesapeake Bay. So for the first 2 decades, every time it rained, that bar would go up and nitrogen pollution would go up. It didn't rain, you had a dry year, pollution went down. Around 2005, those 2 things separated from each other. What Mother Nature was telling us is, every time it rained, it didn't put the same level of nitrogen pollution into the system itself. So she's saying in the last decade, you're actually starting to get ahead of yourselves, folks. You're getting to the point where you're building more resilience into the system. And this chart, I think, shows it very well, particularly on the right-hand side. Those downward green arrows at almost every one of those stations I showed you earlier, over the last 3 decades, nitrogen concentrations in the Chesapeake Bay water, the tidal waters themselves, in its rivers and its embayments, are heading down. I would have never told you in my lifetime, much less my career, that I would have seen something like that. Then on the left-hand side, these are the stations we have up in the watershed in the past decade, and a downward pointing purple arrow indicates that loads, not just concentrations in that, but the load coming down that river into the Chesapeake Bay is going in the right direction. There are places that we see upward arrows, absolutely, but this is significant. No other system, with few examples, say Tampa Bay or a couple in Europe, have seen, against a human tide increase, a decrease in the amount of pollution coming into the system itself. And then finally, as Ann mentioned and opened it up, the Chesapeake Bay's dead zone is heading down. Again, good science-based information, long-term monitoring, that bottom graph that you see there, which is adjusted for flow. So in other words, it's adjusting for hurricanes and droughts out there. Over that 30-year time period, our scientists are indicating that the size and sometimes the onset of it, and when it finishes up in the Chesapeake, is heading in the right direction. Are we there yet? No. We're never going to be able to completely eliminate it, but the dead zone into the future should be more of a blip versus a massive wave coming on there as well. This is significant progress. It's still indicating we got more work to do. We've got climate change coming in there. We've got more people coming into the system, but this is good evidence that that partnership of those 6 lessons learned I showed you, in fact, are working. And another one, my final slide here before we break, is that underwater grasses are coming back. We've seen some die-offs in the last 2 years because of high river flow, but we've seen the same thing. We sort of go up and down, but you'll notice over several years, we had a high point and it drops down because of either high temperatures or river flow, but she makes it back up and then drops down again, makes a higher one. So that's a system building its resilience back in there. So we've got a goal. Depending on the year, we're about halfway there. But I can tell you, when we started out around 37,000 acres out there, I never thought we would see this again in my lifetime, this amount of acres coming back into the system. So I'm going to put this slide up here for a second. There's my contact information. If I can share anything with you, I would be more than pleased. And as we finish up here, and just before we go to the questions and answers, and you're going to finish up with the final survey question for folks. So the question is, what's the biggest challenge today facing Chesapeake Bay restoration? Not only the bay itself, but the watershed, getting it to a healthier condition. So you've got a couple, a series of real big challenges out there. So I'm asking, what do you see as the biggest challenge?
So Rich, while folks are answering this question, this might be a good opportunity for you to answer one of the ones that came through the Q&A, which is, what can we do collectively to help Pennsylvania achieve the goals they agreed to in the blueprint?
That's a great question. Pennsylvania, we don't want to just focus on them because all 6 states in the district, everybody's got challenges and stuff. Pennsylvania, particularly where they're located, is a big challenge because of the amount of agriculture that they're fortunate to have in the state itself. What I think folks on the webinar can do is really to hold the Chesapeake Bay Program partnership, and maybe even more specifically EPA, accountable to then hold Pennsylvania and others in Pennsylvania accountable. So in Pennsylvania, we all know what the challenges are. Pennsylvania's got thousands of miles of streams that they need to clean up themselves. Folks in Lancaster County, for example, right there, that has got a tremendous amount of agriculture, they're trying to work to clean up their own streams and rivers, much less Chesapeake Bay. So it's really, and others, it is the accountability that's got to be put in place. In other words, Pennsylvania's got to bring more cost share for their farmers. They got to bring more enforcement actions out there. They've got to give lending hands to their hundreds of townships and boroughs where they have very local forms of government to help with their stormwater activities out there. Pennsylvania knows what they need to do. They have an interest in it because they drink those waters, they recreate in it, et cetera. They need the resources, funding, technical assistance, expertise in order to carry that out. So it's really putting the pressure, letting your local legislators, letting your federal legislators, letting EPA know that accountability system that I mentioned has got to work there as well. So folks, you are right that actually there's not a wrong answer. Each one of those and all the above, each one of those are actually the key challenges. You can't separate one from the other. You can't put it all on Pennsylvania. You can't put it on climate change or accountability. It's really the combination of those. So it wasn't a trick question, but one that Ann and I said, hey, everybody can come away, and there was no wrong answer on that one as well.
So let's see, the next question is from George, is there enough public funding planned to accomplish the goals that have been set?
No, there isn't. Even states that they're making a lot of progress, Virginia being one of them, Maryland being one as well. There's not, they are still having challenges to get the public funding necessary to provide the cost share for farmers in order to put those practices in place, given that their prices are based on world markets, not just a local market. that there's stormwater practices that still need to be put in place out there as well. Maryland, Virginia in particular have done a lot of public financing. They've done, their state legislators have been engaged, but no, we still don't see, even for the states that are really leading the charge there does need to be more public funding, but it also needs to be backed up by private financing and some more innovative ways of figuring out how to get it done in everybody's own backyard and everybody's downstream watershed and eventually in the Chesapeake.
Excellent. So Kathy asked, has the pandemic impacted our ability to gather data for 2020?
Yeah, it did. Actually, for the first, I think, 2 or 3 months, particularly in the March and April time period, state agencies were not allowing, and universities were shut down. So the folks that were getting out on crews and boats on the Chesapeake or going to local streams and rivers and looking at stream flow, et cetera, were not able to get out there. I think as we got into the May time period, and slowly but surely we're starting to open up. So yeah, unfortunately, we probably lost a good 2 to 3 months worth, and probably the wrong time, and that is that spring to early summertime period is critical. That's when spawning's happening. That's when underwater grasses are coming out. That's when dead zones are starting to creep into the system. So, but we're fortunate. We've got, as I mentioned, a 30, 35-year history. So several months in there, there'll be a blip. But no, that's the resilience of this partnership is even during hard times, we're able to figure out how to get folks out there to collect data. And we've been fortunate, miss a couple, but it did not interrupt the system well enough to do damage long-term.
So I'm looking forward to hearing the answer to this one. Are there active monitoring, is there active monitoring of septic systems on the Eastern Shore to determine the extent of bay pollution caused by septic systems?
Actually, very limited. So you're asking a great question. So septic systems by their nature, unless they're a more advanced one, they're actually not set up to treat. They're set up to sort of settle out and eventually leak their pollutants into the local groundwater. The way that we're able to do that is not individual treatment plant or treatment, not in people's backyards, but the U.S. Geological Survey does have stations out there where they actually monitor the quality of groundwater. And also in some of the streams and rivers like the Choptank, the Nanticoke, the Pocomoke, during what we call base flow season, in other words, when it hasn't rained for a while, all that flow is coming down there is essentially from groundwater. So we can look at the trends of that base flow condition over time and understand really what the pollutant levels are looking like. What we've seen in Delaware in particular, that some of the groundwater levels are actually peaking and they're starting to come down. In other words, what farmers have been doing, what Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia on the Eastern Shore in terms of getting people to clean out their septic systems and actually get new systems in place is starting to work. But actually looking at that very closely, it's one of our places that it's so difficult to look at groundwater. We're fortunate we've got some very smart scientists in our universities and U.S. Geological Survey that have helped us look at that. But no, that's probably one of our weak points from a science perspective.
Let's see. So another question, how much does industrial agriculture contribute to the problem, and how would shorter supply chains play a role?
That's a good, yeah, it's tough to say what of all the, about 75,000 farms across the 6 states in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, mainly family farms. So when you define sort of industrial agriculture, you might think of it as a family farm that actually has 5 or 6 chicken houses, say on the Eastern Shore over in the Shenandoah Valley in West Virginia. But I would say sort of, I'm not sure where that dividing line comes in here. But the challenge is as you're saying, how can you deal with that issue? I think there's a whole set of practices, but your question about, if you can shorten that farm to table connection, that does a couple things. One is it reduces transportation costs for that farmer or whoever they're working, the middle person in there to get that produced in there. It gets a tighter connection in terms of the price so that their goods and produce are not being driven by world markets, much less more regional and local markets. And by having that, there's often more of a funding stream coming into that family farm so that they can, their dependence and their opportunity to do other things in their family farm, in other words, put conservation practices in there, fence out their cows or other agricultural animals out of local streams and rivers, do pasture management, do precision feeding with their dairy. If they have a little bit more income coming in, it can do more practices out there as well. So yes, shortening that, essentially from farm to table is beneficial for local farmers, local economies, and for the Chesapeake and all the rivers and streams in between.
Yeah, so what role do land use, zoning boards, homeowners association plays? In other words, how can individuals get involved? And as you're answering that, let me ask you to bring up the next slide so that we can segue into that.
Yeah, so in terms of how can, both in terms of, you mentioned in land use is really the major thing. In other words, that's at a very local scale, whether it's a township, a county, a city, depending on where you are, as you said, even a homeowners association, how they decide to not only develop that land, but what kind of practices are they putting in place? Are they in fact building a filter strip in there? When they're looking at a parking lot, do they have impervious surface? So those decisions are in fact very, very critical. Some folks say, I'm a homeowner, I'm a renter. How in the heck can I make a difference? Well, that's exactly a place to do it, at that local scale where local land use decisions are made. We're not saying don't develop a set of homes, don't develop a new shopping center. Absolutely not. Progress has got to go on, but there are smarter ways to do that. You can reduce the footprint, like we're asking farmers to do, as you're developing, or even if you have an existing development, how you apply fertilizers in that particular place, how you're dealing with downspouts coming down off of roofs, and are you doing a green roof? There is a lot of opportunities in communities, in developments, for doing things smarter that don't cost a lot of money, but in fact benefit in terms of flood reduction, benefit in terms of quality of streams and rivers. I know my family, we drink out of a shallow groundwater well here. So we're actually drinking waters that were influenced by the farms that were here 20, 30, 40 years ago as well. So that each action that we can take on our local properties, but also through land use decision-making, can make a difference as well.
All right, so I'm just, we've got a ton of more questions, Rich, so hang out for just one second, but I know we're running out of time, so before folks drop off to go do lunch or whatever else you need to do this afternoon, I just wanted to close with sort of two quick asks. And that is that Rich described that we're absolutely making progress. We're seeing that the dead zone is shrinking. And that didn't happen accidentally. It really happened because of educated people like you who were informed and who ask your leaders to be accountable. And so there are two things that we're currently asking our members to do. And again, one of the questions was, can you share this webinar? Remember, we are recording it. I will send the link out to everybody. And yes, absolutely, absolutely share it. But in Virginia, for those of you who are Virginia residents, this is our ask. You might recall that during the past General Assembly session, Virginia's budget for natural resources and water quality programs was almost $500 million for wastewater, for stormwater, and for ag best management practices. It was unprecedented. It was the most state funding we've ever had for water quality programs. But then COVID happened, right? So now everything's on the table, and we clearly understand that the state's priorities have got to be the citizens' health and education. We get that. We're just asking that people weigh in and let their legislators know that water quality, particularly now, is so important. There are so many folks who have reached out to me to say, I'm getting out on the water because it's the only place I feel safe. So let your legislators know that, right? Now is the time to weigh in and just ask them to continue to fund some of these critical water quality programs. So the link to the action alert is there, but I'll also send it out with the webinar recording. The second thing, very quickly, is for everybody else that's on the call, if you're in the Bay watershed, that the House, this is at the federal level, that the House Appropriations Bill includes $5.5 million more in it for the Bay program than last year's budget, which is excellent. This is now going to the Senate, and then they'll mark it up. And of course, the two chambers have to come together to reconcile the budget. But for right now, send your congressional reps just a message saying that you support Bay Program funding, that this is important to you, and tell them where you live and why it's important. So I would just say thank you so much for that. And then we've got, looks like 1 more minute. We'll get just a couple more questions in, Rich, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay. So I love this question. It says, what is the logic of using 1950 as the target? It appears to not have been self-sustaining.
Yeah, actually, back then, you're right, it wasn't self-sustaining because we were part of the Green Revolution. Fertilizers were coming in there. 1950s, while we mentioned that, that's about the time that dissolved oxygen was still very good in the bay. We saw a little bit of dead zone, but not very much. We saw good underwater grasses. Some of our 185,000 acre grasses goal was set based on looking at good levels of grasses in the 50s and 60s. In terms of catches of oysters and rockfish and crabs. So it was not 1950s itself, but the Chesapeake ecosystem we last saw that had people in the watershed in the 1950s. That's what we're basing it on. But you're right, it wasn't sustainable because in the 60s, you could have walked across the Potomac River on the algae. By the 70s, Hurricane Agnes had said, and the Chesapeake Bay was spiraling. So it's not the conditions and not the sustainability of the 1950s, but the conditions before the Chesapeake really started to tank into the 60s and 70s at that point.
Okay, let's do 1 more. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for agriculture to contribute to the Bay budget, and how would you measure that?
I think actually the biggest one is working with individual farmers and with people they trust, and that is particularly universities, extension agents, and their soil conservation districts, and refiguring out how much nitrogen and phosphorus and commercial fertilizers versus manures do they really need to put on their particular crop. Crops like corn, soybeans, and others have actually been modified, not genetically always, but modified along the way. But what we're recommending that our farmers put on the ground out there oftentimes is based on 1980 science. It doesn't reflect what we've understood over the last several decades. So probably the key thing would be get farmers positioned so that they maintain their yields, but they can actually put less nitrogen, phosphorus, commercial fertilizer, and or manure on their crops, still get the profit they need, but less runoff from that. It's a smart thing because farmers, if they can save money on going how many times they go out to the field, and particularly when they apply commercial fertilizers, and they can still get good crops. I like to eat local produce, etc. It's the best way to do it. It's the most economically sustainable. We need to do that. How you measure that? You actually measure fertilizer sales. We have other ways of looking at how much manure is applied out there. And what we found is over time, there's been some behavioral change, but as those crops have improved in terms of their ability to absorb nutrients, farmers still apply what they did 10 years ago. We got to use better information coming from those land-grant universities they trust to sort of curb that diet a little bit at their farm level.
All right, guys, there are a couple more questions, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna put the question, I'll post the answers, and I'll put the Q&A in the link back to everybody so that you can see. We'll just type the answers to those. There's only a handful left. So I just want to say thanks again. Rich, thank you for a great presentation. We really appreciate it. I learned a lot, always learn a lot. And for those of you on the phone and on the webinar, we really appreciate your attention to this. Obviously, we think it's important. The rest of the world thinks it's important, and we're thrilled that you spent the last hour with us learning about this. So thank you so much. And with that, I'll bid adieu. All right, bye guys.